And what you start sensing is that nobody's posing the real question, which is before we ask the question, who killed John F. Kennedy? It's much more valuable to ask, why was John F. Kennedy killed? And usually when one trains their mind to investigate history as a process instead of a collection of things, of events on a timeline that just happened, one starts actually answering the deeper questions of causality. Because history is not something which happened. History is something, as most of you here have begun to realize, history is something which is happening. History is a process that we're living in. Like right now, this is history. And so people often are trained in school and just in the general materialistic society that we're conditioned to adapt to, that the universe is made up of a collection of things in space that just happen in linear time. And that history is a study of things that have already happened. So, you could get people say, oh, John F. Kennedy, I'm not interested in that. I like, name a fetish, right? And they don't realize that what occurred in history has been based on a battle of ideas. That there are conceptions that have been at odds with each other that go back a very long time. To the point that for thousands of years, in written record and most likely long before that, there have been conceptions that have defined mankind as something not all that different from an animal, another cow on the plantation. And so, for those who define mankind by his material characteristics, well, just like a cow, there's a certain necessity to establish order by lying to the masses, by keeping the masses in a state of stupor, conditioned to be very obsessed over their pleasures, avoiding their fears, like any animal would be. The opposing view, which we've seen historically, has expressed itself in the form of Renaissance thinkers who rediscovered Plato, who were motivated by the concept that mankind isn't just his material qualities, but rather our minds, that this immaterial aspect that allows for us to shape concepts of who we are, of what the universe is, the principles that shape the behavior of the universe. That's what defines the emotions that we get when we advance on our understanding of the universe, that when we share ideas, when we fight to free people from the bonds of mental servitude. This type of quality is really what makes a human and not simply a monkey or a cow. And this is what motivated the founding fathers of America. And in our best experiences, this has been everything that the oligarchy has been ravenously afraid of and motivated to destroy by obscuring the truth and keeping people convinced that there's no point in asking the question why, because there's infinite amounts of answers to a question. There's no answer to anything as causal. So don't even ask the question. Just get by, get a job, get some money, feel good, but don't try to move your mind into places that are too metaphysical or too obscure. This is what we're going to go into. By understanding where we are right now in history and our role to the future, our responsibility, we can better look at, well, why was John F. Kennedy? Right? What role did John F. Kennedy play in history, and how did he see himself in a higher process? So this class that I'd like to give will begin by looking a little bit before JFK enters the political stage, by just looking briefly at what was the political and historical dynamic that he walked into. Now everyone's seen these pictures, right? Throughout the course of World War II, you've had an alliance against Hitler, where these three representatives of the Allied powers tended to participate in conferences in Yalta and all over the place together. Now, people's actual understanding of what was going on today is very, very superficial. Because you'll always find that Churchill and Stalin are never sitting next to each other. Between Churchill and Stalin, you'll always have Roosevelt. And today, people have an idea that America and Britain have been close friends, since they let bygones be bygones after World War II, and now you've got Anglo-American allied special relationship, and that's just the way things have always been. The reality is that the course of World War II, as the battle was being waged, it was highly undefined of what the post-war world was going to look like, as it was becoming more and more apparent that Hitler was not going to win because of Roosevelt's intervention into that war. What Roosevelt organized with Stalin was an alliance such that by the end of World War II, the world was going to be dominated by sovereign nation states, not one world government, as the British circles of Churchill, like John Maynard Keynes, had called for as a one world currency under the Bank of International Settlements. The whole policy of the British Empire was to have a one world currency. This was what they wanted the Bretton Woods to be. And you had people like Roosevelt who said, no, the world is going to be governed by sovereign nation states with a concept of progress, and that what we really need is to break out of this whole Wall Street, London desire to have one, total global control, as he knew that people like the Wall Street bankers, like J.P. Morgan, had financed an attempted coup d'etat against him, multiple assassinations against Roosevelt in the 30s. And these networks were active all over France. Vichy France was, of course, a big fascist government that Charles de Gaulle fought against, who supported the Nazis. And Britain, if you look at the royal family of Britain, of the Netherlands, were all devout Nazis. The Queen's own uncle, good King, I believe it's Edward VII, right?
No.
The Eighth? The Eighth. Was the biggest European fan of Hitler, who helped supply massive amounts of loans, investments, because they were all eugenicists. Like fundamentally what the oligarchy in their junior partners in Wall Street and the oligarchy in Europe, the old families, what they all had in common is that they were all allied around the idea that mankind being a beast, well, simply that our qualities of who we are defined by our genetics, something material. Thus, for the ruling class, the management of society is who is fit to live and who is not, right? And maintaining that sort of idea of a complete, fixed, controlled system of no change. And that's an empire. So Roosevelt was against that. And Roosevelt and his allies, who understood this, came out very heavily with a continuous message for the post-war world. And Henry Wallace was Roosevelt's vice president. Who here knows Henry Wallace? Yeah. Some? Okay.
Partially, I do know that quote of his, though. That quote of his, I do know it.
The code?
Yeah, this one, what you're saying, I have heard.
Oh yeah, right, okay. So this is a brief message to the American people as a call to action so that people could begin to imagine what the post-war world was going to be. Where he writes, or he actually spoke at a speech in 1942, "This is a fight between a slave world and a free world. Just as the United States in 1862 could not remain half slave and half free, so in 1942 the world must make its decision for a complete victory one way or the other. The people, in their millennial and revolutionary march towards manifesting here on earth the dignity that is in every human soul, hold as their credo the four freedoms enunciated by President Roosevelt in his message to Congress on January 6, 1941. These four freedoms are the very core of the revolution for which the United Nations have taken their stand. We who live in the United States may think there is nothing very revolutionary about freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom from the fear of secret police. But when we begin to think about the significance of freedom from want for the average man, then we know that the revolution of the past 150 years has not been completed, either here in the United States or in any other nation in the world. We know that this revolution cannot stop until freedom from want has actually been attained." And this was reflected again and again in the fights that Churchill waged with Roosevelt over post-war policy. Roosevelt continuously enunciated that the world can't be dominated by 18th century British methods of free trade that have kept the nations like Africa and Asia backwards and undeveloped, but rather has to incorporate 20th century methods that involve giving technology to these people. And he described greening the deserts of Africa. And this is something which had shaped the imaginations as he organized every single leader in the third world country in South America, in Asia and Africa, as he spoke with every single one of these individuals and painted a picture of what their future could be as a sovereign country, this created an inspiration that couldn't be stopped. And these countries began really yearning after World War II for sovereignty, for actual independence. So Roosevelt dies, and who starts the Cold War? I mean, does everyone here know exactly why the Cold War started? Truman, right? A lot of people today have an idea that
it was kind of set during the end of World War II, no? I mean, like
The Second
British, they were like goofing off during the
Yeah, and Alan Churchill, he wanted to have Operation Unthinkable as soon as Germany was defeated.
That's right. Yeah, there's the
Monstrous, that's no wonder the British people voted them out.
So this is the thing, right? What you had was the Roosevelt-Churchill alliance, the policy that Henry Wallace had planned with China to get rid of the feudal system in China by working with Ho Chi Minh, not Ho Chi Minh, with Chiang Kai-shek, sorry, that's Vietnam, in order to bring about an industrial, advanced, science-based society where feudalism would no longer be accepted. All of these policies became reversed, and all of the former allies that worked together in World War II to stop fascism became enemies. And a lot of the enemies in Japan and Germany became allies. And how was the sleight of hand done? Well, like Salim said, this was Churchill himself being on invitation by Truman coming to the United States in '46 and calling for the Cold War. That now an iron curtain has fallen between the countries of socialism and capitalism. And that's going to be an absolute polarization. And no longer is anybody going to try to think about imperialism in its true essence. Because both capitalism and socialism can become imperialist, as we've seen. So the actual real essence of oligarchy was increasingly forgotten. Now, in the midst of this, the oligarchy statement of intent came out very clearly in 1946. Again, this is right after Roosevelt died, and immediately when Roosevelt dies, Truman launches the Churchill-Bertrand Russell option for using nuclear bombs on a surrendered Japan, just as a statement of an Anglo-American global empire, as an ambition. And again, there was like Salim said, there was already a plan in play to start using those nuclear bombs against the Soviet Union to get them to submit.
What's this unthinkable business? Is it plan unthinkable?
Operation Unthinkable, why it was called that is what Churchill wanted
But
is...
is that referring to what he's...
Yeah, what Churchill, it wasn't dropping nuclear bombs on Russia. What Churchill wanted is as soon as on May 8th, when Germany capitulated completely or signed the surrender, Churchill wanted on May 9th to take the forces that were present on the Western Front over there in Europe and just attack the Soviet Union. Like Japan was still in the fight. They didn't surrender until August. But they forget Japan.
That's right.
We'll take care of it later. Let's just concentrate on attack. And just as what they did with Italy about 2 years prior, they wanted to recruit the Germans right now without any indoctrination. At least I think that this is what they were trying to do, and just use them against the Soviets.
That's right. And this is where a lot of the psycho faction around Bertrand Russell came in later, calling for actually using the nuclear arsenal in '46 and '47 to bombard the Soviet Union preemptively in order to have them submit to a one-world government, which Bertrand Russell writes in many times directly. And this guy's known as a global pacifist. He'll come into our story a little bit later. Now, in response to this faction of nation builders who are allied with Roosevelt, you have a manifesto, a sort of statement of intent by one of the leading representatives of the oligarchy, the grandson of Thomas Huxley, the bulldog of Darwin, named Julian Huxley. Another one of these devout eugenicists. In fact, every time you see a British aristocrat in this period, just assume that they're also a devout eugenicist, and you'll usually be right.
That's not
Who writes in the founding document of the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization in 1946. In its founding document, he writes, "Political unification in some sort of world government will be required, even though any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible. It will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable.
I know, it's crazy, man. I know, I've seen this quote many times.
Mhm.
It's official.
Exactly.
And people
So this
don't
would
get
be
it, man.
This is where you have to teach people a little bit of rigor. But here's the thing, right? Because why is it unthinkable? Because Hitler lost the war and people began to realize what the consequences of eugenics were. Even though you were studying this stuff in McGill College and all of the highest level universities, get a PhD in eugenics and start promoting science of purification of global society from the unfavored races. So why was this unthinkable? Because, yeah, again, when Hitler lost, people began to realize, okay, there are social and political consequences to these doctrines. They're not just scientific objective theories. And so he's saying we have to prepare the mind of society who just stopped fascism and who was inspired by progress to accept something which is unthinkable. So, in this world, now you have the complete polarization, nations hungry for progress and for a real chance at dignity and defining their own destiny for once. And you have all of these new countries which are being told to pick a side. Soviet bloc, or capitalist. Which extreme are you gonna pick? Right? And so JFK is now entering onto the scene where, again, just to point out, the shadow government in this period has created essentially a police state in the United States. The U.S. has become, under McCarthyism, under the J. Edgar Hoover control of the FBI, the U.S. has become essentially a police state. People are snitching on their neighbors, everyone's a communist, and everybody who was, like Henry Wallace, working with Roosevelt becomes labeled a Soviet agent and is expelled from any position of authority in academia, in military, in politics, in intelligence circles, in the OSS. And from the OSS, which was filled with real patriots, you have now the creation of the CIA in 1945. And this is what JFK has to deal with as insane imperial wars like the Korean War have already been underway, and a lot of the greatest patriots have been thrown out of authoritative positions. So JFK now enters, and we're going to play a brief 4-minute clip of a speech that JFK had given that I think gets at very quickly his general epistemology.
The kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
And that's just a little tiny segment. So you definitely have a sense that he doesn't have this very naive belief in like some final solution, some end point around which, you know, we've attained all we can do, we've plateaued, right? We have the formula to save civilization. He didn't have that type of very naive view. But rather you see very clearly that there's a sensitivity to the fact that we live in a constant change, that there's a constant progress which we have to aspire to. And in this way, your creativity, your ability to solve problems, if you have this idea in your mind that there's no end point to civilization, your ability to solve problems is going to be very, very much more enhanced than anybody who has an otherwise, what's otherwise called an entropic idea of the universe. That the universe is fundamentally reaching some sort of an equilibrium, right? That mankind, with his relationship to nature, is centered around some equilibrium of no change, which is natural, and civilization, which causes change, is unnatural. And these types of ideas have become very popular in our society. Right? That civilization is unnatural, is bad because we cause change too much. We're overpopulated. We consume too much. All these crazy things that people like JFK never would have submitted to. And as he was running in his presidential campaign of 1960, it was a very, very active year in the world. You had 13 African countries declare independence from France. You had 2 countries declare independence from Britain. Algeria, the Algerian war against France, was underway. And Kennedy really took a very firm stand. And this is the thing, when you look at why JFK was killed, well, his entire campaign was completely anti-colonial to the core. And he put pressure on the French government to back off on Algeria. He put back behind the Algerian rebels, as did many patriots in Europe, like Enrico Mattei. He put pressure on Portugal, on the fascist government there, to back off of its territorial possessions of Angola and Mozambique. And the idea of like also Nigeria and Somalia, he also put a lot of backing there as well. And JFK made a lot of admired friends in the developing world, who saw that, just like Roosevelt, he meant business. He wasn't just trying to get at their... And JFK comes out. Avni, would you care to read a quick quote by JFK at Stanford University in 1960?
Call it nationalism. Call it anti-colonialism. Africa is going through a revolution. Africans want a higher standard of living. 75% of the population now lives by subsistence agriculture. They want an opportunity to manage and benefit directly from the resources in, on, and under their land. The African peoples believe that the science, technology, and education available in the modern world can overcome their struggle for existence. That their poverty, squalor, ignorance, and disease can be conquered. The balance of power is shifting into the hands of the 2/3 of the world's people who want to share what the 1/3 has already taken for granted.
So this is a period ripe with potential, again. At this point, you have John F. Kennedy building strong relationships with Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. Of this fellow here is Ghana's first president, Nkrumah. Over there is a dam that JFK helped sponsor called the Akosombo Dam in the Volta River, which actually has a plaque right next to it dedicated to John F. Kennedy. Because unlike the imperialists who simply wanted to give African countries, they couldn't deny that the developing countries had too much momentum behind them. They were going to get independence one way or the other. The European oligarchy had the intention simply of giving them nominal independence, name only, but prevent them from actually having the means to control their own economic destiny, from controlling their own, like JFK was saying, the bounty on their own land and under their own land, or to have their own national banking systems. These things were not permissible under the logic of empire, who still wanted to maintain the controls and the levers of the system. So, people like Nkrumah, people also like Sekou Touré of Guinea, who built a strong relationship with JFK. JFK actually sent ambassadors to every single African country and told them explicitly to ignore all CIA intimidation, all European intrigues. He basically said that you are running the show here. You obey American national policy, me, and none of these other interests. It wasn't just Africa either. You had India. He built up a great relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru of India. Did I pronounce that badly? Yeah? How badly did I pronounce it?
Jawaharlal Nehru.
That was very
Yes,
close.
I
I
did.
think I was very close. Who helped build the most advanced steel industry in India. Indonesia had a president at the time named President Sukarno, who immediately latched on to JFK's offers to help industrialize and build nuclear power. And President Diem of Vietnam as well had a nuclear reactor produced by John F. Kennedy, or John F. Kennedy's assistants. Egypt's Nasser basically was very happy to see JFK reverse the policies of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who under Eisenhower had helped promote the British line of, this whole Suez Canal crisis that the British started. Though Eisenhower thwarted it, the Dulles brothers were always trying to inflame the situation. And when Kennedy came in, he completely reversed it and gave Nasser his backing. So, you have also South America, and the idea around Vietnam, when I mentioned President Diem of South Vietnam, well, JFK had understood that the colonial policy wasn't just about keeping nations underdeveloped, but getting America to go into insane and unnecessary wars and get these countries to break up and to have secessionist movements so that they would have civil wars. And you had this in a variety of countries all over Africa, all over. Vietnam was a case study of that. President Diem had his big problems, but he did support JFK's approach, which was don't go into Vietnam. JFK listened to Eisenhower, he listened to MacArthur, he listened to de Gaulle, who all had experience fighting these types of wars in Asia, and they all said don't do it. Don't listen to these psychotic generals who are all completely gung-ho. And JFK had already had some experience with the Bay of Pigs. As soon as he walked in, his presidency was almost sabotaged by the fact that Allen Dulles had gotten. Everybody here is familiar with the Bay of Pigs? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yeah. But
So,
who's Allen Dulles? No.
Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA.
Oh, okay.
And he had set a ball in motion to get all of these expatriates from Cuba.
Operation Gladio?
No, the Bay of Pigs
Yes.
was involved with taking these exiled Cuban exiles
Yeah.
and send them to take over or to attack Castro, send it to Cuba, and he promised them all American military backing.
Okay.
And that was in 1960,
Okay.
61. This almost became the Vietnam before, right? This actually was almost the war that would have created World War III. But JFK was smart in a certain way. He pulled off. He didn't allow the American military to go in. It was an embarrassment for him nonetheless, but it did give him a sense of the pedigree of the CIA, of these different psychos in his own administration.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came down to Vietnam, he was absolutely against going in there, and even passed a resolution called National Security Action Memorandum 263, calling for the removal of any advisors from Vietnam. Today, people don't even know that. They think that John F. Kennedy is the guy who started the Vietnam War. And you get that when you were actually organizing people around JFK. They're like, oh, but he started the war in Vietnam. Yeah, so JFK understood that it's not through going and blowing the hell out of a country that you're going to get anywhere, but you got to provide them progress. And he understood also that Ho Chi Minh, who was the head of North Vietnam, was not actually the demon that everyone had cooked him up to be. In fact, Ho Chi Minh was an ally of Roosevelt. And Ho Chi Minh, if you actually look at just to give a sense that this is not about communism versus capitalism, that was never the case. Ho Chi Minh, the so-called evil communist that the Americans fought against, created his declaration and wrote the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam in 1946, and actually used as his base. Well, actually, I'll just read it out here just so you guys can get a feel for this. But in September 2nd, 1945, the Vietnam Declaration of Independence read, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. That's the preamble of their Declaration of Independence.
It's basically, you might as well just Xerox.
That's exactly what they did. So, I mean, the thing is, Vietnam was completely backstabbed, and JFK was sensitive to this fact that as soon as World War II was over, all of a sudden the Truman Doctrine was go with the French fascists in recolonizing all of these territories that had fought Hitler. And so the partitioning took place, and the war was set up.
Does Vietnam still have North Vietnam? Vietnam still has a constitution like that?
That's its constitution.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so with this idea of progress, of offering nuclear power to South Vietnam, of going for a military avoidance strategy, but also finding points of agreement, right? Where can we work together in scientific projects? Where does nature create boundary conditions? JFK had a huge water desalination program because we don't have enough water in the world, right? And one of the points that he got at is he had nuclear desalination plants planned with Russia, with Mexico, Egypt, with Nasser, Arabic countries. And there was a joint policy for an Israeli-Palestinian nuclear water research center, a nuclear water desalination research center, so that you could actually begin greening that region and create a condition of engineering projects for both sides. This is exactly what LaRouche has been fighting for with the Oasis Plan since the 70s. Right? And this goes back a very long time. And JFK in '56 was very clear on this, that that he understood that our new discoveries into what matter is would unlock all of the keys, not just of overcoming our problems, but of opening up the keys to human curiosity, to giving people a chance to look beyond their limits. And the atom was, and still is, the necessary direction if we're actually going to get out of this imperial system. And he writes, or he actually spoke in a speech in '56, that a Middle Eastern nuclear center similar to the Asian nuclear center already proposed, which could bring untold benefits in energy utilization to former deserts and wasteland. These projects would be developed and administered under the auspices and control of the nations in the region. The benefits would be mutual. And then, so what do you have? You the whole time you're in the Cold War, you're on the verge of nuclear annihilation every step of the way. And JFK's policy, like we said, it's not just a negation. His idea of war avoidance, as he said and as we've seen, it's not simply stop fighting. It's what is the principle of change that we can introduce to find people who don't think alike to see what unites them in a common mission. And in the case of Russia, his work there involved not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, where all of a sudden, we all know about the 9 days where we were on the brink of a nuclear exchange with Russia. Right? For 9 days, there were nuclear bombs set up in Cuba that almost triggered a global holocaust. And luckily, Nikita Khrushchev didn't want nuclear war either. He was kind of freaked out by the idea of exterminating the species. And so fortunately they had a certain rapport and were able to work out in a back channel an exit strategy where the Russians could leave, the Russians would save face, and after he won this and beat out all of the generals, I mean literally every general wanted to bomb Cuba at that time to destroy the nuclear facilities, except for the president. And Nikita Khrushchev also had similar problems. All of the generals in Russia were all warmongering maniacs as well, and they were all going for a war in the same vein. So you luckily had a rapport amongst, common sense did win. And through that came the Test Ban Treaty, where Britain was pissed off because now the Russians and the Americans agreed that no longer were going to use atmospheric nuclear bomb testing anymore. And we're actually going to start creating corridors of dialogue and entente. All right, so here's the shocking thing. A lot of people today think the whole moonshot was just about beating the Soviets to the moon, right? We heard that. That's all the moonshot was about. The moon landing was just about beating the Soviets, that was all. There's no nobler sentiment than that. Well, actually, I was going to play the actual video of JFK, but rather than jump back and forth. JFK actually, if you actually read the September 30th UN General Assembly speech, JFK refutes that himself when he writes, "I include," or Dave, you wanna give it a read?
Yeah.
I include among these possibilities for great power cooperation a joint expedition to the moon. Why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but representatives of all our countries."
Mm-hmm. Right, so the real path to peace is not an absence of war. It's really a question of what is the future, right? How can we actually introduce a state of something better in discovering something that we don't yet know about the future? And he made multiple propositions to the Soviets, and sadly it wasn't accepted. But the statement of intent, I think, is very, very solid. On science policy in general, I mean, not to go into any detail here, but in terms of approaching this idea of shortage, JFK's water policy, because I mean, when you're dealing with the management of society, where society is going, the future always has scarcity. If you don't have new technologies and new discoveries introduced to get you liberated from reliance upon, boring, low-grade qualities of energy or resources. There's a reason why we don't necessarily burn wood to stay warm anymore in the developed world, right? Because we've made creative revolutions into better forms of energy-dense material, which today have put us onto the path of thorium and deuterium and tritium. This is something we already should have had a long time ago, and we can go into that a bit more, but the point is that water shortages were very well known by John F. Kennedy as something which had to be dealt with. There's a limited amount of space on the Earth. The Earth is only so big, you can't deny that. There's only so much coal and so oil. His policy involved, on the water point, a bold policy. I mean, we have a whole video called The WWII in 1964, which goes into how all of JFK's organizing in the last months of his life involved getting people to think about the continental management of water and energy resources in the Americas and beyond. But the North American Water and Power Alliance was something which was being produced in his day by his allies, and that he was moving directly into building, and his brother was directly signed on to this. The idea of massive water desalination, because how else are you going to get water? You can either move it from where there's not much of it, or where there's too much of it, to where there's not much of it, but a lot of people. And that's NWAPA. You can get it by desalinating lots of it that's in the oceans, right? And this is involved with his water resource council that he proposed, which by 1970 was going to have 150 million gallons per day of fresh water produced from the oceans. And by 1975, it was going to be up to 800 million gallons per day. And a lot of energy. I mean, the amount of energy that would have required to separate the salt from the fresh water so that you can start doing things that involve producing more food instead of trying to cut back on our water usage like we're doing in the continent today. You could be having a hell of a lot more. This involved massive nuclear energy. And his energy policy called for, I mean, literally by the 1980s, the entire United States should have been already a nuclear-based society. So all of the British eugenicists, they're effectively, this is another, you know, they're all, this is the Malthusian agenda. And JFK is explicitly anti-Malthusian in his approach to resource scarcity, because your two choices when you have a scarcity is either to adapt to the scarcity, right? If there's too little food, well, kill some people, right? That's the current policy of the IMF towards Africa, or Obama towards, or you can introduce discoveries and overcome the scarcity by getting onto better forms of scientific discoveries, better forms of resources that we don't know yet, but that's the other approach if you're a human. So the root of the first one is Malthusianism, and in an address to at the anniversary convocation of the National Academy of Sciences on October 22nd, 63, maybe JP, would you like to read this?
JFK refutes Malthus, October 22nd, 1963. Malthus argued a century and a half ago that man, by using up all his available resources, would forever press on the limits of subsistence, thus condemning humanity to an indefinite future of misery and poverty. We can now begin to hope, and I believe know that Malthus was expressing not a law of nature, but merely the limitation, then, on scientific and social wisdom. The truth or falsity of Malthus's prediction will depend now, with the tools we have, on our own actions. The earth can be an abundant mother to all. Can you move, Matt? The earth can be an abundant mother to all the people that will be born in the coming years. Abundance depends now on the application of the sound biological analysis of the problems of agriculture, and the long-term answer to inadequate food production, which brings misery with it, must lie in new research and new experimentation, and the successful use of new knowledge will require close collaboration with other nations.
Mm-hmm. So that's pretty strong.
That's,
So you...
just saying that I've heard dozens of Malthusian type things. According to some people in like 1910 or something, the world was not supposed to have bread after 1950, but I think that's what I had for lunch.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, because Malthus denies, like every imperialist, that man has a creative spark. And if that's the case, and we're just the sum of our flesh, then sure. The limits that we had when he wrote this in 1791 were maybe 1 million people on the earth, and that should be just a fixed way that it always would be. So the very fact that mankind progresses is a refutation of Malthusianism, even though it's the base of the current green environmentalist movement. Now, how is he going to actually carry out and finance a lot of these larger programs that involved massive space exploration, helping the development of third world countries, and massively investing in upgrading the US economy? Well, there's a direct, JFK began his career after the Bay of Pigs by firing the Anglophile psycho Allen Dulles directly, and 2 other directors of the CIA. I don't know if that's something that, I guess most people do, maybe they hear that as a factoid, but that's big. The other 2 were Richard Bissell, who was a Harriman banking interest fellow who actually got to start in Wall Street, and Charles Gabel, who was the brother of the mayor of Dallas. And all of these 3 characters were expunged, and JFK was known for having said to his friend Clark Clifford in an interview later that something very bad is going on within the CIA, and I want to know what it is. I want to shred the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them into the 4 winds.
Who said that?
John F. Kennedy.
Wow.
And so he had a complete, by understanding the nature of this beast, he threw out a strategy to take complete control over what the CIA was doing with its shadow government functions and its police state crap and all of its regime change operations in banana republics and move it back into the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So, on the one hand, you're taking on this beast. On the other, you do have constant sabotages coming out from Wall Street, from the J.P. Morgan groups that control the steel industry, that are trying to sabotage him, that are contracting the gold supply so that there's no credit that can be made available for the development projects that he's intending to build. And the Federal Reserve is the major mechanism of the London-based oligarchs in the United States to keep the nation submissive to monetarism. So how does he deal with that? Well, who here knew that JFK had a plan to shut down the Federal Reserve? You guys knew about that? You know about that?
Yeah, there was an executive order basically that.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was actually Executive Order 11110
Something like
that he issued on June 4th, 1963, to completely just give the U.S. Treasury the power over issuing notes for the financing and the credit necessary to develop the country's needs. Why go to some private bank like the Federal Reserve at high interest to keep your nation as a debt slave, when you could just do what Lincoln did with the greenbacks and issue the credit necessary? And up until 4 months after his assassination, $4.3 billion of these silverback treasury notes were brought into circulation and used to finance the advancement of things like NASA, of the moon landing and beyond. 4 months after he died, though, these things were discontinued. Though the law still remains to use that, it's never been taken away. However, nobody had the balls to actually shut down the Fed and apply this law, once again, like JFK had done. Though with Glass-Steagall, that's the quickest way of getting at that. Because as soon as you pass Glass-Steagall, you immediately are forced to admit that you're forced to demonstrate that the entirety of the Federal Reserve's asset books are worthless. It's bankrupt. And by admitting that, you can now shut it down and get an actual national bank through the Treasury that JFK was fighting for. So he made a lot of enemies. And he actually, this is a fun little quote, where he writes, he spoke 7 days before his assassination that there's a plot in this country to enslave every man, woman, and child. Before I leave this high and noble office, I intend to expose that plot.
Now, that's amazing. I've never seen that quote before. I don't know why that's not quoted more, but we should have a sign with that.
I agree.
For all those people who say we don't believe in conspiracies,
it's easy enough to blow that apart. So the thing, it immediately gets fishy, right? Because who, right after JFK is assassinated, is in charge of the commission to investigate the causes of his death? Well, it's the very guy who headed the CIA, who JFK fired for being a traitor, Allen Dulles. So JFK's arch enemy in the shadow government becomes the guy who heads up the committee to investigate his assassination. As if that's not shady. People say that this is where you get very, very uncreative, brainwashed people who say, "Oh, this sounds like a conspiracy theory," as if that's essentially become. People have been programmed to treat that as a bad word, almost.
Yeah,
it's like, "Oh, you're a leper." Sorry, I don't want.
It is a conspiracy because there's more than one person involved in the thing that, by definition, that makes it a conspiracy.
That's right, and that's the whole sick joke of this thing, is that when you actually look at anybody who's been involved in the U.S. government, who's been worth anything today or in the past, they all knew and said openly on various occasions that this was a CIA operation, that there was a higher conspiracy to do this, and a simple glancing at the facts is adequate to convince any honest truth seeker that this is the case. The danger today, though, is that being we're in the information society, right? And I'm saying all this as a bit of a disclaimer for what we're about to go into, because people today are very obsessed with information. Show me your information, and then maybe I'll come to a judgment on something. As if the information itself is enough to carry with it the wisdom to say, I will judge something as being right or wrong. It's true that you need information, but in the case of JFK, for example, every single discrepancy, and there's a lot of discrepancies with the Warren Commission report, which Allen Dulles headed up, there's things that when you actually look at the data, the information, and you look at the idea of a lone gunman shooting from a building way behind JFK, right, in a book depository, there's no way that that explanation of a lone gunman and the actual information could ever work. It doesn't work. And it ignores the complete political context of what JFK was doing, who he was fighting against, which structures and forces were operational. It completely ignores all of that. So it's an apolitical, it's an operation. And people like, if you want to look at other conspiracy theorists, well, you need only look at people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his father, Robert Kennedy Jr., who both wrote and believed that the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, were part of a broader conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy was cited by Avenit in the briefing today, having written a whole expose on this just this week. And another guy would be Lyndon Johnson, right? The very president who took over the reins from John F. Kennedy, said in an interview later on that he was afraid the entire time that he was in there that he had the same the same bullets that shot JFK aimed at the back of his neck the entire time. And he even said that there's an assassination cabal being run by the CIA in the last interview before he died. So,
Yeah, sit down.
yeah, I can send you anybody who wants any of these sources, I'll send them out by email.
Yeah, I heard about that. I was actually about to say, my God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he said, I know there's something, but I can't put my finger on it. Like, I know there's this.
Look, he was too afraid. He was too afraid to just go outside and say, yeah, they shot Kennedy. I'm sorry.
Well, he did say in his last interview that he believes it was the CIA running an operation from the Caribbeans, but we can go into that as a little bit later. The point that the disclaimer I'm trying to make is that I'm going to go through some things in a cursory way, which could lead one into a storm of detail and lose sight of the big whole picture. Which what I'm going to do is just produce some of the summary overview players. Namely, Jim Garrison, who was also a conspiracy theorist, but one, I mean, this guy was the district attorney of New Orleans, and up till the day, he's the only guy who's actually had a jury trial for the conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, which began in 1967 and ended in 1969. And he's the district attorney of New Orleans, produced some very explosive material. But, I mean, the key that he focused on is the first blatant paradox, which is, I mean, if you actually had a lone gunman in a book depository shooting at Kennedy, who had been situated approximately right about there in Dallas, Texas, then not only would he have had to have shot through a bunch of trees that would have been completely in his way, blocking his field of vision, but it would have had to have accounted also for... As soon as JFK was killed, this film taken at the time of his death by a fellow named Zapruder was purchased by one of the heads of Life magazine and subsequently locked away in a vault for several years, never to be seen by anybody, until Jim Garrison forced this thing to come out into the open. And what this thing shows you is, this is an irony. Keeping in mind, if this was one bullet from
We can't
behind...
see here.
Oh.
Yeah, but just keep hold of it, like.
Huh?
I know.
Alright, so just tell me if you see something fishy, based on the fact that the common story is what? One bullet from behind, in the back, through some trees, shot the guy from the back. Tell me if something is fishy.
I've seen this before.
Okay, JFK shot in the throat.
That's the second shot. Now his head explodes.
I'm sorry for that. That's very
That's-
gruesome.
That's what's fishy.
That's an exit wound. That's a definite exit wound of a rifle round.
It's the momentum from the front to the back.
It's the momentum from the front to the back.
Yeah, like
Right.
this. It must come from the front, not from the back. This is obvious.
Although to be honest, however, when his head popping off, it was consistent with an exit wound of a fairly high velocity round over there, which would have been done by a rifle.
Yeah, what we're saying though is when you're actually seeing somebody getting shot from the side, based on something, you know.
entrance wounds are generally very small. It's the exit wounds that really cause the massive.
Yeah, but you gotta look at where the head is going back towards too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is the whole thing.
Like this guy was
But-
definitely shot twice because he was gagging for several seconds before
Yeah.
his head blew up. Bullets don't, you know. Like I said, another thing is that the guy who.
But I don't want to go into more details, man. I mean,
That's not why.
why I'm doing this. I just pointed out that like this is what Jim Garrison zeroed in on as a key point to investigate a bigger picture. Because if you have an irony like that, you have to see, well, okay, if there were multiple shooters, this is a conspiracy. If that's the case, where does the evidence lead? And he started asking questions that nobody else was doing in the course of this jury trial against a fellow that led him to, or that he basically was led to a fellow by the name of Clay Shaw, that guy, David Ferry, and Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. Now, Jim Garrison, and I'm going to use very soon an excerpt from his book On the Trail of the Assassins, where he describes the network that these guys represented. Because what Garrison proves is that
I just want to just put in like that if you have ever seen like the movie or whatnot, like if you look into this, most people know Clay Shaw and David Ferry, but Major Bloomfield, where does he come from?
well, that's what we're going to go into.
Right. Okay.
Because, like Pascal just said, even in the Hollywood movie JFK of Oliver Stone, these two guys do come up. This guy does not. And he's the most important one. But in talking with witnesses, and there are a lot of witnesses, and this is actually also something very fishy, but there were enough people who pointed out that the handlers of Lee Harvey Oswald, who himself said that he was a patsy the whole time, who himself warned and sent a note to J. Edgar Hoover warning of an assassination against John F. Kennedy 2 days before it happened. This guy, who was obviously what he said he was part of a network, which is a very weird circus, and you guys can read all about it in the EIR, and I could send articles out. But there was a whole CIA nut house created in regards to overthrowing Castro and setting up insurgency operations there in New Orleans, which these guys were both parts of. Both of these guys worked for the CIA, and they were both handlers of Lee Harvey Oswald, who himself was an FBI informant and had a bunch of a very weird background. But and again, this gets really strange as you look into it, but the most important thing is these guys were handlers who were seen with Lee Harvey on multiple occasions, even getting him registered to vote, and setting, well anyway. Clay Shaw is on the board of directors of Permindex Corporation. Not only that, but he's also on the board of directors of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center.
Sorry, just because
Yeah.
I think, what does Permindex stand for again?
That's Permanent Industrial Expositions.
Okay, yeah.
And it's sort of a subsidiary. These things both work together. They were founded by this guy, Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who's also a board of director of both of these companies. And he owns 51% of the shares of Permindex at that time. And why does Jim Garrison zero in on these figures and specifically Permindex? Well, Permindex is it's an organization it's a very, very shady thing. Nobody can quite say exactly what it does or what the World Trade Center, they're effectively promoting industrial exhibitions and things like that. But what he proves is, and he goes to the fact that these things are banned from France. The Permindex, which had recently just set up shop, having been based in Montreal, Canada, it had then set up shop in Italy, in France, in Switzerland, and from all three of those countries, it had been banned in 1961 and 62. Why was it banned? Because President de Gaulle proved, with his special, he proved that the 13 assassination attempts, at that time there were only a couple, that were run against him, were being financed directly by Permindex. And so these things were not allowed to set up shop anymore in France, in Switzerland, in Italy. And they basically moved their shop down to Johannesburg in South Africa when apartheid was going on and you had a bunch of crazy things there. But anyway, the thing is, why don't we know about these people? And this is the, and also, why didn't Clay Shaw, and even the judge who presided over the trial, which lasted over 2 years, was shocked to find that Clay Shaw was acquitted. He thought, even the judge admitted later in an interview that he thought he was guilty, that enough evidence was proven. But the thing that got him off the hook was that nobody could prove that directly, empirically, that Clay Shaw and David Ferry actually knew each other. David Ferry had he made it easy for, well, David Ferry died, basically, in 1967, through very mysterious circumstances. Clay Shaw basically said, I lied under oath the whole time, just said, I never met the guy in my life, I don't know him, it's all weird that people are accusing me of being with him at parties and plotting the murder of JFK. In fact, even his own associates and friends of David Carey, who had been at multiple parties with these guys, heard them with other figures plotting for a triangulated assassination of JFK, and they gave testimonials. But because no empirical evidence, as if like no multiple signatures on the party list could be found to say, okay, they were both together at this party, because of that, he was acquitted. And that was sort of the weak link. It was only after the party, after the acquittal, that this picture comes up showing that, indeed, David Ferry, looking all crazy and creepy over there on the left, and Clay Shaw with some weird funky wig, are indeed together at some party in 1949 at that. If this had been presented during the trial, this would have completely sealed the deal, and this would have led to an investigation of Permindex. Because that wasn't done, because he was acquitted, the investigation stopped short in an official setting.
So I get my question.
Yeah.
Why Permindex though? We're talking about these figures, but why do we need Permindex to
Because-
talk about these figures?
Because Permindex Clay Shaw sits as a board of director on, he's director of Permindex with Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, and Permindex is the global institution which has been kicked out of France, Italy, and Switzerland for having been caught red-handed running and financing the assassination attempts against de Gaulle, and probably the explosion of the plane that killed Enrico Mattei, who was working with all of these African countries, like Nkrumah, even helping to build the dam in Ghana, working with Nasser to help build the dams there. So Enrico Mattei was an ally of the JFK networks and of de Gaulle, working to thwart the oligarchy, and he was assassinated probably by the same networks. So,
I just want to know one thing. The
Yeah.
picture you showed me, this picture, what, are you suggesting someone blocked that in the court, or?
it was actually published in a magazine, and nobody actually found it until after the court was over. So it's not that it was blocked; it's that people didn't have the wits to actually just look in this published magazine,
Okay.
which apparently some journalist actually had in his briefcase, who was sitting and watching the trial. It's very fishy, but it's unfortunate. Now, in Jim Garrison, this is 2 pages of his book on the Trail of the Assassins. From there, we're going to move to something a little bit more juicy. Jim Garrison, who himself was highly slandered his entire life, much in the similar way. If you Google Lyndon LaRouche or you Google Jim Garrison, or usually anybody who tends to say anything true, you're going to get some crazy wild slanders, and that you should test it out and see what you get by Jim Garrison. But this man actually had conviction, consistently fought his entire life to have the truth exposed. And in this book, in '88, writes, "It was not until much later, well after the Shaw trial, when it could have been of any use to us, that we discovered Shaw's extensive international role as an employee of the CIA. Shaw's secret life as an agency man in Rome, trying to bring fascism back to Italy, was exposed in articles in the Italian press, which we obtained from Ralph Schuenmann, secretary to philosopher Bertrand Russell, who had been one of the earliest supporters of our investigation. According to these articles, the CIA, which apparently had been conducting its own foreign policy for some time, had begun a project in Italy as far back as the early 1960s. The organization, named the Centro Mondial Commercial, the World Trade Center, had initially been formed in Montreal, then moved to Rome in 1961. Among the members of its board of directors, we learned, was one Clay Shaw from New Orleans. However, in 1967, the Italian press took a close look at the board of directors of the Centro Mondiale Commerciale and found it consisted of a very curious collection of individuals. The board contained at least one genuine prince Gutierrez de Spadaforo, a member of the House of Savoy, whence came Umberto, the last of Italy's kings. Spadaforo, a man of considerable wealth with extensive holdings in armaments and petroleum, had once been the Undersecretary of Agriculture for Il Duce, Benito Mussolini. Through his daughter-in-law, Spadaforo was related to the famous Nazi Minister of Finance Hjalmar Schacht, who had been tried for war crimes in Nuremberg. Another director of the Centro was Carlo D'Amelio, the lawyer for other members of the former Italian royal family. Another was Ferenc Nagy, the exiled former premier of Hungary and the former head of the leading anti-communist political party. Nagy was described by the Italian newspapers as the president of Permindex, ostensibly a foundation for permanent exposition and an offshoot of the Centro Mondiale Commerciale. Nagy, the Italian newspaper said, had been a heavy contributor to fascist movements in Europe. Yet another director was a man named Giuseppe Zigiotti, the president of something with the congenial title of Fascist National Association of Militia Arms. One of the major stockholders of the Centro was a Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, a Montreal resident originally of American nationality and a former agent with the Office of Strategic Services, out of which the United States had formed the CIA. This then was the general makeup of the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, on whose board of directors Clay Shaw served. Judging from the background of its members and the fairly heavy activities in which they were engaged, the organization could not be confused with the Shriners of the 4-H Club.
What's that?
Well, the Shriners is just a bunch of old guys with funny hats, fezzes. I don't know what the 4-H Club is, though, Bob? You know?
Yeah, it's like farming, agricultural.
Okay. The Centro was described in 1967 by writer Paris Flamond in The Kennedy Conspiracy as apparently representative of the paramilitary right in Europe, including Italian fascists, the American CIA, and similar interests. He described it as a shell of superficiality, composed of channels through which money flowed back and forth with no one knowing the source or the destination of these liquid assets. The Italian government had no problem distinguishing the organization from the Shriners and the 4-H Club. Before 1962 was out, it had expelled the Centro Mondiale Commerciale and its half-brother Permindex from Italy for subversive intelligence activity. Last page, I promise. Perhaps because of its Montreal origin, the Centro aroused the interest of a Canadian newspaper, Le Devoir. Referring to Ferrand Nagy, one of the Centro's directors, it wrote in early 1967, Nagy maintains close ties with the CIA, which link him with the Miami Cuban colony. Nagy subsequently emigrated to the United States, making himself at home in Dallas, Texas. Summing up the fate of the two related enterprises, Le Devoir stated, "Whatever the case may be, the Centro Commerciale and Permindex got into difficulties with the Italian and Swiss governments. They refused to testify to origins of considerable amounts of money, and they never seemed to engage in actual commercial transactions. These companies were expelled from Switzerland and Italy in 1962, and then set up headquarters in Johannesburg. The ultimate evaluation of Clay Shaw's Centro Mondiale Commerciale by the Pesa Sera stated, among its possible involvements, supported by the presence in directive posts of men deeply committed to organizations of the extreme right, is that the center was the creature of the CIA, set up as a cover for the transfer of CIA funds in Italy for illegal political espionage activities. It still remains to clear up the presence of the administrative board of the center of Clay Shaw, an ex-major of the OSS, Bloomfield. As for Permindex, which Clay Shaw also served as a director, the Italian press revealed that it had, among other things, secretly financed the opposition of French secret army organization, OAS, to President de Gaulle's support for independence of Algeria, including its reputed assassination attempts on de Gaulle. So the whole book can actually be found online. And this is something some of you guys may have seen walking out of Square Victoria Metro. So, to this very day, the truth hasn't fully come out on what this thing actually is. However, this does lead us, when you start looking at the names and figures of the boards of directors in the European Permindex operation, and a lot of the royal connections that they have, because you'll find that a lot of these guys are either themselves royalty or themselves lawyers for royalty and their peons. Bloomfield himself was a major lawyer specifically for the Bronfman dynasty, which had been put there by the British Empire to create an entire drug culture and criminal syndicate underworld during Prohibition times that still today runs much of Canadian politics. The Privy Council is endowed with a Privy Councilor named Charles Bronfman. His son is one of Justin Trudeau's handlers, Stephen Bronfman. So what you have is a very, you're touching on the nerve of something big here, right? And China is that there's a higher level to this, where many of these figures, well actually let's just say this, when JFK died, the effect on the culture drove people generally insane, and that's not an exaggeration. The psychological trauma that caused on the international community, as well as specifically Americans, was, I mean, this was more powerful than a lot of people imagine. The very creation of the World Wildlife Fund, the creation of the entire environmentalist movement, which is not at all based on saving nature. The founders of it, people like Prince Philip, Prince Bernhard, are renowned for hunting game of endangered species like white rhinos. So they don't really care themselves about conserving nature. In fact, most of the nature reserves that these guys have created over the years are used primarily to train paramilitary groups in Africa and South America, and launder drugs.
Yeah,
So
they just want the public to be out of it and not have to see anything.
yeah, so this could not have taken over the cultural imagination and political institutions if JFK had lived. And this is where you have a coming together of the death of JFK and these forces, because, well, the manifesto, even when you go to the World Wildlife Fund website, what they claim is as their self-professed manifesto that created the whole modern global environmentalist movement is called the Morgues Manifesto, co-authored by leading Privy Councilors, Max Nicholson being one, Julian Huxley being another, and representatives of the royal families. This manifesto clearly stated, and it was published in 1961, that all over the world today, vast numbers of fine and harmless wild creatures are losing their lives or their homes in an orgy of thoughtless and needless destruction. In the name of advancing civilization, they are being drowned by new dams or butchered in the course of political upheavals. There will be an international trust registered as a charity in Switzerland under a distinguished group of trustees closely linked with the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. This trust will administer funds raised on a worldwide basis by national appeals in different countries and by a high-level supporting club of leading citizens of many countries. These, in addition to contributing substantially in money, will form an active group of men of affairs actively interested in reconciling the twin claims of human material prosperity and the survival of the enduring values of wildlife within our developing civilization. What the manifesto and its authors are describing needing to be created in order to essentially save nature from civilization, right? Everything that JFK, that the leaders in African and Asian and South American economies were desiring for a better life involved nuclear power, involved building dams, involved massive infrastructure. All of these things, they're saying, are destructions against nature, the orgy of thoughtless civilization, which has to be made the true enemy, not imperialism, of course, right? Mankind himself. So this is where we start getting at two bodies. Well, actually, one body which has a subsidiary. The World Wildlife Fund is created by Julian Huxley, Prince Philip, and Prince Bernhard as the founders in 1961. This thing doesn't have the revenue necessary to fully complete its functions that it wants to, do. So a few years later, you have the 1001 Club, upon whose which essentially works as, and it's a self-professed financing mechanism for the World Wildlife Fund. So you have 1,001 chosen men of distinguished affairs who all give $10,000 to become members of this club that's founded by Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip, who had also founded the World Wildlife Fund. And in Canada, the Canadian coalition of these chosen upper managerial members is Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, Maurice Strong, Lord Conrad Black, and Peter Monk. And on the board of directors, when you actually look at the layout of this club, you start getting a lot of people who are all members of the World Trade Organization in Europe, of Permindex. It's one institution. This is all part of the CIA. It's not a CIA conspiracy as such. The CIA itself was created, right, by the British and their Anglophile allies after World War II, but as a tool to get something higher done. This is where we start getting at the real intentions, the top-down intentions of what's shaping the policies.
Just remind me, though, how are you making the leap between the whole Permindex thing and the World Wildlife Fund? Like, what's the...
Well, Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who runs, he is the owner of Permindex in Montreal, based out of Montreal, becomes the vice president. He's not just the founding member of the 1001 Club, right? So he's on the list as with these guys, but he becomes the vice president of the World Wildlife Fund during a time in 1974 to 1978 when Prince Philip is serving as its president. And as soon as Bloomfield is relieved of his duties, one Maurice Strong, who's also a founding member of the 1001 Club, takes over for him as vice president of the World Wildlife Fund. Peter Monk, being himself an international, gold and resource mining magnate who brought us things through his Barrick Gold Industries, as the Rwandan massacre of the Hutus and the Tutsis, which Barrick Gold played a leading role in catalyzing and just basic rape of Africa. And Barrick Gold is one of the biggest, dirtiest mining cartels in history. And Lord Conrad Black was, this is the guy who had a global media empire. He's like the Rupert Murdoch of Canada, who gave up his Canadian citizenship so that he could be accepted and rewarded by the Queen to become a Lord in the House of Lords of Britain.
It's disgusting.
Yeah. So
So the link, though, is really through this guy, like the fact that Bloomfield is on, he's in Permindex, he owns Permindex, he's a founding member of this.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, what becomes the policy, right? After JFK is killed, well, Maurice Strong is a good indicator in terms of foreign policy about how this whole Malthusian agenda of eugenics is then repackaged under a new form of environmentalism and then brought into countries aspiring for development. Because what does Maurice Strong do? Well, here, just a quick thing. Let's just read two quotes from Maurice Strong. Both from 1992, one from his essay, Rio, A Journey Down a Generation, because he was one of the founding members of the Rio Conference on the Global Environment. He had been the founding member of the UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, that first really laid out the thesis of carrying capacity, depopulation as a way to save the world. But so he writes, the concept of national sovereignty has been an immutable, indeed sacred principle of international relations. It is a principle which will yield only slowly and reluctantly to the new imperatives of global environmental cooperation. What is needed is recognition of the reality that in so many fields, and this is particularly true of environmental issues, it is simply not feasible for sovereignty to be exercised unilaterally by individual nation-states, however powerful. The global community must be assured of environmental security. So, in another encounter in an interview during that same year, after the Rio Summit, he's speaking with a woman by the name of Elaine Dewar, who herself is an ecological journalist who writes a book later on called The Cloak of Green, where in the course of her studies for a book that was originally going to promote global greenism is a good thing, she discovers what the real agenda was all about. And in it, she posts this discussion she had with Maury Strong, who's revealing an idea for a book he wants to write as a thesis. And she's pretty horrified, and rightfully so. Where Maury Strong writes, "What if a small group of world leaders were to conclude that the principal risk to the earth comes from the actions of the rich countries? And if the world is to survive, those rich countries would have to sign an agreement reducing their impact on the environment. Will they do it? The group's conclusion is no. The rich countries won't do it. They won't change. So in order to save the planet, the group decides, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?"
Jesus, no.
So
He's saying that.
Yeah.
All right.
You can get
I'm
the
not
cloak.
asleep, I'm saying.
Here. So yeah, you can actually get the Cloak of Green in order your library. Who's Maury Strong, right? Because the role he plays is he's brought in through the Privy Council to become the head of the Canadian External Aid Offices in 1967. And in that office, not only is he running, he's running similar conferences, selecting people like Paul Desmarais to head up Power Corporation of Canada, which he was formerly the vice president of up until '62. But he selects people like Pierre-Elliott Trudeau in these little conferences being run in Quebec and Montebello to see who's got political talent and who we're going to prop up and who we're going to leave on the side. So this guy's part of the inner echelon. Himself, just a cardboard cutout recruited by the Rockefellers in the 40s. But the point being is this guy is one of these powerful psychopaths who's been put into a position of a lot of influence. And as the head of the Canadian External Aid Offices, this guy basically promotes the idea of getting rid of John Diefenbaker, getting rid of John F. Kennedy's approach to providing technology and nuclear power to third world countries so that they will become sovereign and independent, which was the Canadian policy with the Colombo Plan, providing, because for example, who did provide India with its first nuclear reactor? It was Canada, it's a CANDU, or it's an NRX actually. And who supplied Pakistan with its first nuclear systems? It was Canada. Now, that whole policy had to be thwarted. And in exchange, what Maury Strong is set up to do, it sets himself up to do, or is set up by others to do, is to make foreign aid simply become money-based and based on this idea of appropriate technologies. So all of the programs that he creates with what becomes the Canadian International Development Agency, which even to this day is the conduit by which foreign investment is made into third world countries, this that he creates in 1968 is designed to work with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank, so that these countries that receive Canadian aid have to do it in what's called tied aid. On the one hand, it means that these countries can't develop, like let's say you want to build a bridge, well, the local receivers of the money won't be able to produce the engineers to build the bridge themselves. They have to use, let's say, a local cartel from the country that's providing the money. So they're not allowed to create a culture of engineers, where they're going to use foreign engineers that do it for them and get out. Meanwhile, the money can only be given on the conditions that these nations submit to IMF conditionalities, right? And this is what we all know now has been what the oligarchy has used to get these countries to become debt slaves over all of these years and get the rate of debt to accrue far beyond any ability for these countries to ever pay. So, on the two hand, that's on 2 points. On the third point, this idea of appropriate technologies was cooked up so that they could take an idea of creativity, this idea that mankind is always going to want to make science, make discoveries, but pervert it so that instead of going to higher energy dense forms of power, like nuclear power is a very high energy dense form relative to like a windmill, rather than do that, you're going to use technology just in such ways that the natural environment is not impacted. You're not going to use it in such a way that will involve creating a power to desalinate bulk water to green a desert, because in the law of the World Wildlife Fund of Prince Philip, the ecosystem is natural, not being changed. If it's a desert, it's natural as a desert, not being changed. If a people in an indigenous culture are tribal, that's their natural state. If you try to give them an education or if you try to change anything about that, like a cell phone or something, that's you infringing upon their right to be left alone and be natural. So this whole crazy crock of shit was all pumped up, not to save nature, not to try to preserve indigenous cultures. It was done to impose a Malthusian depopulation agenda upon the world, and to get people to really just forget that there is something in Renaissance and classical culture which scares the shit out of the oligarchy. That mankind, in developing a creative sense of poetry, of music, of drama that we see in the most advanced thinkers of our times and of ancient times, we become free. We gain insight into how the universe works and how our mind relates to that universe and to other minds. That's why Mozart is a threat to the oligarchy.
Yeah.
And today you just have to look at it, right? Because what has the policy become in Africa? If you actually look at the so-called scientific and technological investments that we have been making into Africa over the past 40 years, well, geez, this is one quick graph of the biofuels market that has been forced upon Africa. Instead of being able to produce food for your people, these countries have been induced, those countries which have been endowed with massive amounts of green regions that can grow food, have been induced to use that not to feed people, but to burn it in gasoline tanks and provide money for speculators who gamble on the biofuels profits. So the sugar cane, the corn, the wheat, everything. These are all countries in pink that are being induced, and this is how they get the loans from the IMF. This is how, if they want to be able to build a bridge or pay their basic necessary revenues for their civil workers or whatever they need to do as a country, they have to, as part of their conditionalities, create massive biofuel markets. And this was never a demand. Like anybody who says like, oh, biofuels are just part of the laws of supply and demand, no, that's bullshit. There was never demand for biofuels. This was imposed. And it's the same thing for windmills and solar panels. There's never been a demand for windmills and solar panels. This could only exist because of massive amounts of government subsidies. There's no economic benefits to this. The amount of energy that goes into making a solar panel or a windmill turbine is way more than that panel or turbine can actually produce for the net benefit of society. You can't make any argument on any level that this stuff is legitimate. And yet, these are all the countries as part of desert tech, which have been induced in North Africa where they get a lot of sunlight. They're told, well, look, rather than go with this policy of desalinating water, moving groundwater to the surface, instead of doing these things, use all of this great desert to plant solar panel systems all over the place. And on the coastal regions, you can have a bunch of windmills because it gets really windy. And then, because the green policy has induced people to go stupid in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, so that they've gotten rid of their nuclear power systems, right? Germany's trying to phase out of nuclear power. Italy and all these countries are being induced to do that. So where are they going to get this massive missing black hole of energy that they need to sustain their existence? Well, they can get it from Africa. So the Africans can. Now, how do you get around this thing? Because this is completely anti-human. This is Dark Age thinking. This is like the world is fat type of flat
Yeah.
type of thinking. And so, how do you get out of this? Well, you need to look at. Well, this is a quick image I had of everybody else who had died during the 60s, which I found to be very interesting. But I mean, the degree of assassinations that were very traumatic for young people is outstanding. But you look at what all of these people are doing, and there's a lot more than this. I couldn't fit all of the assassinations in the 60s on one graph.
Yeah, Charles de Gaulle, his last words were, "It hurts."
He didn't actually die of assassination.
No,
He
he didn't.
survived.
He survived more assassinations than any other person. This guy is an unbelievably
Yeah.
lucky bastard.
He had a serious
So-
guardian angel.
Yeah.
No, he was smart. But so not just in that time frame in the 60s, but also if you look at all the assassinations in the world since the Renaissance practically, but especially in the case of American presidents, there's always a common principle that tends to occur. And like Evnit said at the beginning, the question asked is not who killed what president, it's why is it only the good presidents who are shot, and the schmucks, they stay in there, right? No scratch usually. Well, it's because they're doing the same thing. And anybody with a bit of a spark of truth-seeking will be able to quickly discover that there is a principle that they're tapping into and are expressing self-consciously, some more, some less self-consciously, but they're all doing it in a way that will bring about the destruction of imperialism of the global oligarchy. I won't go to that. Sorry. So today, what do you have? You have Russia, you have China, you have a lot of countries rallying to the support of war avoidance on the one hand, Silk Road, or the Iron Silk Road, uniting all of these Asian and Russian economies into Africa to increase real prosperity. Not depopulation, not green anti-science policies, but rather nuclear power, space exploration, and the World Land Bridge is something that LaRouche's been fighting for many, many years. And if you actually look at the Russian government's website, there's been on it for a number of years now, 3 years, actually a little bit longer, the very proposition to build the rail connection under a tunnel between the Bering Strait, which would open up whole new doors of cooperation and new cities, new ideas of expanding civilization into uninhabited territories and creating alliances and bonds with countries that under Obama's policy and under the Queen's policy will become our enemies. And we could be facing what JFK was facing in the Cuban Missile Crisis with the current war policy of surrounding China and Russia. So you do have this intention, you do have policies such as the asteroid defense program of the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, which is very, very important for people to study because this is, again, Russian policy. If the US takes down their anti-ballistic missile system, we could unite, as JFK had made the announcement in 1963, we could unite for a common defense of Earth against extraterrestrial, I don't mean aliens, but extraterrestrial problems like giant rocks. And beyond that, we can unite towards space exploration, which goes with. So these policies are available for us right now. And Canada plays a very important role, just geopolitically, in this process as well. And we have, when you look at our history, we do have a good aspect, which was the Diefenbaker approach to foreign policy and development versus the more strong version, which we've become brainwashed by. But I figure what we can do, in terms of getting revenge for JFK, what they did 50 years ago, I figured I would leave it for LaRouche to say a few closing words that sort of put this all into a deeper context.
The point was to crush, and the means of the crushing was to use the international banking system to crush the U.S. economy. That's how it was done. To loot the banks of in the United States, to destroy them, and then to turn around and loot the United States. That's what happened. And we continued to be looted up to the time of the Civil War. But then what happened? As usual, the President of the United States was assassinated. Under British direction. It came from London, our enemy. And you look at the list of presidents who were assassinated, and lo and behold, great mystery. Why was it that all the honest presidents were murdered? You go to the list of the murdered presidents. The murdered presidents were all murdered under the direction of the British monarchy and that system. Why don't we wake up? Why don't we wake up to truth? We know this? Okay. Why don't we do something about it? Now we have a new alliance is emerging in this world. It is centered in the Pacific region. Europe is looted. Germany is the last nation which has any remnants in Western and Central Europe, has any significant capability now. And they're trying to destroy Germany because that's an obstacle to what they want to get done. But that's where we're headed, in this direction. So therefore we have no resort except to use our national sovereignty and pass judgment upon what these foreign powers are. Now, what we have is, what we have now. China is a nuclear power, as is demonstrated. Russia still has a nuclear power element in it. What's going to happen now? You're now going to try to crush these nations, national groups, which are still viable, where the United States is no longer viable economically? That's what you're up against. Therefore, what we have to do now, by hook or by crook, as they say, we have to throw this system out. We have to foreclose on all these swindling banks. Look at the banks in Germany of question are swindlers. It's a complete fraud. It's been gone through. It's a complete fraud. Most of France was running a fraud. Now France is bankrupt too, because it frauded itself into destitute or something. So we have to start on the question of the consciousness of what reality is. If we don't understand and accept certain guidelines, you lose. Your case is hopeless. Either you fight these guys, either these nations fight against them, or you're all dead, as good as dead. Are you going to live? Do you have the guts to live? Do you have a sense of immortality? A sense that your life may terminate, but what's important is what your life has done for your successors? You don't have that kind of guts anymore in people. And they don't have even an idea of what they could be, what they could do. Looking at this in that frame of reference is the only way that you can ever come to an understanding of what you must now do. As many people before us in nations and parts of the world have done to try to save civilization. We too are called upon to save civilization and to save our own republic. If we have the guts to do that, that's good. But if you don't have the guts, what are you going to do? You're going to connive. You're going to try to make wheels and deals. You're going to connive. And what will that get you? The same thing has gotten you during most of the period since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You've got nothing. Everything has been worse since John F. Kennedy was murdered. Everything is worse. There has been no progress in net in the U.S. economy since John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That's a fact. Then how do you suppose they beat us? With our own cowardice.
So I think that ended it quite well. The issue of immortality that LaRouche has been hammering at is really the key that one would see and feel from the writings of JFK and the life that he lived and people who had a similar identity, which is the thing that, I think this really hammers at the point. People don't realize the power that we have. Right? If you think about what mankind represents in the universe, it's the most incredible thing in terms of the power we have to accomplish great changes within not just the Earth, but beyond, for as long as space-time continues to exist, which I don't foresee ending anytime soon. You have something which people completely lose with this green ideology of man as a virus. Our only property is the destruction of nature, because every time we try to build civilization, we destroy things. So this is the thing that we have to really work on tapping into, and we have to organize to do that, because you can only find yourself elevating somebody else if you yourself tackle your own inner demons that are keeping you from becoming elevated. And that's the way that history moves, right? People actually jumping into the fire and figuring out how do we get over our blocks that are keeping us from becoming what we need to be if humanity is going to survive. So if you guys have any questions, we can...